Hello, everyone. Welcome to Grace Every Day, a podcast for Christian wives of blue-collar guys to help them get healthier and happier. So today's podcast episode is on one of the most overlooked and yet completely practical areas that we need to think about in terms of everyday life: what we are consuming. And I don't necessarily mean physically eating. I've talked a lot about that in other podcast episodes, but I mean what we're consuming in terms of the content that we are allowing inside our brain, the content that we are allowing to influence us, to influence our thoughts and our emotions, our habits, our behaviors, because what we consume can, if we're not careful, end up consuming us. And we don't stop to think about that all the time. And it's interesting because we will all have locks on our doors of our houses, right? Those doors are there to keep us and our loved ones safe inside. They're there to keep intruders out. They're there to protect us, right? To provide safety. A home is providing the shelter and safety that we need to be safe, to keep our family safe. And we understand that on a physical level, that we have to have things in place to help keep us safe, to help keep our family safe. We don't stop to think about what are those safeguards that we have for protecting our mental, emotional, our spiritual energy, just like we protect our physical body. And it is just often completely overlooked. But when you think about it, everything from what we're scrolling on social media to what we're binge watching on TV, what we're reading, what we're listening to, what we're watching, what we're thinking about, who we're talking to, it's just as important to be diligent about what we're consuming in those areas as well as what we're actually physically eating. And because everything impacts us, right? Everything influences us. Energy, especially negative energy, is incredibly contagious. But the things that we listen to, watch, read, and people we talk to, what we're scrolling on social media, all of these things do affect us, either positively or negatively. Now, maybe they're only impacting you in a small way, but maybe they're impacting you in a big way. But when you think about even just a little impact over time, just grows exponentially, right? So a couple of good examples about this. Philippians 4:8 reminds us that whatever's true and noble and right, whatever's lovely, anything that's excellent or praiseworthy, we should think on these things, right? And that is just such a great biblical reminder of we need to be focusing our mental energy on the things that are good, because what we focus on expands, right? What we think about all the time is going to grow in terms of importance. What we are allowing to influence us will magnify and compound over time. So super important to be diligent about that. You would not let somebody in your house that you didn't know. You would not let a stranger that you knew is negative just walk in the door without putting them out, without kicking them to the curb, right? You wouldn't just let anybody waltz into your house, your physical home. And yet we are not nearly diligent enough with the things that not only we consume, but what is our family consuming, right? What's impacting our kids? I know a lot of times we think about that in terms of social media and parental controls on the TV and things like that. But I'm not just talking about the things that you need to block against, but just the little ways that those streams of influence can impact us in so many ways. I was out for a run a couple of days ago, and we're in there was 2 or 3 of us in our little run group, and we were talking about leadership and influence, and someone asked me what my opinion was of a particular leadership expert or leadership influencer. And I had to share, I'm not going to share the name of the influencer that they asked me about, but I had to share, I said, we can all learn great leadership or personal growth principles from, almost anyone, many great sources of wisdom out there, and we can learn something or glean something, a nugget or a quote or a thought, a principle, an insight. But my particular concern with this particular influencer is that they use just a lot of profanity. And I went on to say, you know what? I'm not coming from a place of judgment here, but I feel like number one, the English language is pretty expressive without using those words. And number two, it's interesting that someone who is talking a lot and teaching about leadership is not considering how their language is impacting those people around you. I wouldn't encourage a teenager, for example, to study a lot of leadership principles from that particular influencer because of the profanity. Again, not coming from a place of judgment, my point here is to make sure that we are intentional about thinking about how everything that we're reading, watching, listening to is affecting us in little ways. I've said it before, I think it's Jim Rohn who said, we become the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with. Now, that could absolutely be true, like in our friendship circle, our close relationship circle. The people that we choose to voluntarily spend time with impact us. We start to act like them and think like them and dress like them and eat like them. So it's really important to be careful about who's in that circle. But it's also true in terms of who's influencing us from a distance, right? Not just the 5 people that we're choosing to hang out with, our friends or our close relationships, but also who are the top 5 authors that we're reading or the top 5 podcasts that you're listening to. And again, not the question here isn't what's right or wrong. The question is you being intentional about how are these things influencing and impacting you, and are they helping you go the right direction? Are they helping you move forward? And so when you start to think about that, it's the little influences, right? Again, that compound over time. And that, Philippians verse just brings us back that reminder, that powerful reminder that we have to be intentional about aligning our thoughts on what is good, what is right. Because negative energy is so much more contagious than positive energy. And, this is, you can apply this concept or this principle in so many different dimensions of life. But when I think about that, for example, I like to read, but one of the ways that I ensure my growth, my personal growth plan, is reading 50 nonfiction books a year. So averaging out to about 1 a week. Now, reason number one that I do that is it does help just keep me on track in terms of my intentional growth plan. What are the things that I can do to help me grow and develop? And that's a great way to do it. And it's worked for me. I've had that goal, that metric for years. But number 2, it also is just a great reminder to me, or a great balance, or great check and balance, if you will, of, I absolutely love to read some fiction books too, but I want to make sure that I am being intentional with the amount of content that's helping move me forward, is balancing out the content that is just recreational or relaxing. There's nothing wrong with watching a movie or a show, but also making sure that hasn't taken up too much of your free time or your free space, so that you don't have time and energy to devote to the things that are more of a priority, that are going to move you forward. And so for me, that looks like, sure, I have some fiction books on my Kindle, but I also have a list where I'm intentionally reading at least one nonfiction book every single week, right? Keeping that in balance with recreation, relaxation. There's a place for that, but making sure that doesn't become all consuming. Now, you have to figure out how that principle applies for you and your family. But my point here is the content that we consume isn't neutral, right? There's no way that something we're reading, watching, or listening to just doesn't impact us at all. It's either impacting us and influencing us in a positive way, or it's impacting and influencing us in a negative way. Now, again, maybe that's a small impact, maybe it's a small influence, but it's not neutral. It's not a zero impact, right? It's either lifting us up or pulling us down. Much the same way that our relationships are. Those personal relationships, people who influence and impact us, either positively or negatively. But there's no zero impact when it comes to influence. And what we're consuming, what we're putting into our brain, it impacts our mood. I mean, we've all felt that when you watch a movie that has a sad ending, and maybe it's a good tearjerker, but that impacts your mood, right? It's not just impacting your mood. Things like what we watch or listen to or read can impact our decisions. They're going to impact our habits, because the content that we consume normalizes behavior. And I think all too frequently it's normalizing a societal, if I can say that word right, ideal that's not necessarily in alignment with our Christian walk with God. And so when we think about that, it just becomes, again, so much more important for us to be intentional about what that looks like. 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. And you read that in context of 2 Corinthians, and it's really, again, one of those powerful biblical reminders that those principles, even in the Bible, still impact us and apply to us today, of being conscious of capturing our thoughts, being intentional with directing our thoughts, and directing them in a positive way, right? Thinking on the things that we need to think about. So it's almost like we need to be perhaps even more diligent these days in terms of social media and streaming, and the amount of content that every one of us consumes has increased exponentially. Again, we're watching more TV these days. We're scrolling more social media these days. We're watching more reels on Instagram and TikTok. And it's that amount of content that people in general in our society consume has increased 1,000% over what people consumed 100 years ago, right? When they were reading books back then, but they were not reading nearly as many books. There just didn't have as much access to information out there. And particularly with the internet, with social media, there's just not really a good filter for what information is out there, what content is out there that is positive versus what is negative. And unfortunately, people are drawn to the negative. And so our social media algorithms out there know this. And so the algorithms like to give you things that are negative, or that you spend more time watching. We all know, you spend more time watching one ad, you're going to get 10 more ads like that, or 10 more pieces of content like that, because the algorithms figure out what draws you in. Their whole intent is to keep you on the platform longer. And so the way they do that is by drawing you in with content that engages you and you interact with. And unfortunately, people are wired to engage with and interact with content that is negative, right? Drama is what sells. And so there's more of that out there. Again, not right or wrong, but just simply being aware, simply being intentional that there is a very intentional method out there to keep you on social media and consuming negative content longer. And it can just draw you in, right? We've all had that experience of, you go to check Facebook or Instagram, and suddenly you spend 15 minutes and you look up and you don't even know where those 15 minutes went. So it's very easy to get pulled in, and that's because it's very intentional on their part to draw you in and keep you there. Because the more time you're spending on the platform, more advertising, and the more, their whole methodology is based on how much time they can get you to spend on the platform. It's the same way with music or what we're listening to, right? I mean, all of these platforms are intentionally designed to demand more and more of our attention. And I think we got to put up guardrails, just like we put up windows and door locks on our house, and say, we're going to be very intentional about what we will and will allow and how much we will allow those things to impact us. And intentional is the key word here. Again, there's absolutely a place and a time if you need some recreation to sit down and watch a great movie to stream a great movie or a show. But making sure that that's not consuming too much of your time. Making time for the priorities is what's most important, right? But be careful what we allow to influence us. And we know this intuitively. It's one of the things we are careful about with our children, right? It's why we want to monitor what our children are watching or listening to, because we know that what they're watching and listening to can impact them. But I think we become less diligent or less careful with this as we grow into adults. Either we think that we are immune to the effects of influence and impact of influence from these sources, or we just haven't stopped to really think about how critically important it is. And I don't know about you, but I have enough of just a daily challenge to stay positive without worrying about negative things impacting me and pulling me down, right? It's hard enough to keep your thoughts in alignment with biblical principles and with good positive things and to be proactive. It's hard enough to do that on a daily basis without overcoming even more negativity or more things that can impact you in the direction that you don't want to go. So when we think about the content that we're consuming and what it's normalizing, now the fascinating thing to me is that you can apply this from everything from food to clothing trends, for example. It's interesting, like styles in terms of clothing, women's clothing, just kind of come back around, right? And what was in style 5 years ago is not what's in style now, but there pretty much have been trends and they just kind of cycle through and back around, right? And so it's interesting because when that first starts to change, and like, for example, waistlines of pants. Back in the probably early 2000s, it was like super low rise, everything. And then today, 26 some odd years later, it's high rise. Everything is high rise, high rise. And when that shift first starts to happen, it looks weird, right? You're so used to seeing one fashion trend and then somebody starts wearing a different fashion trend before it's a trend. And you first see it, or you first see that style and you go, ooh, that's weird. And then you see more of it and you see more of it until at some point you're like, that looks perfectly normal. Oh yeah, I think I need a pair of those. So, again, just a great example of how what we're watching and listening to and looking at can shift our mindset. Well, when you think about that principle applies to our food. It's why commercials can influence us in terms of ordering out food. Have you ever just really been craving broccoli after watching TV? No, because all of the commercials are about yummy looking, cheesy, high carb, bad for you things, right? So everything does influence us. It's just a matter of being intentional about how that's influencing us. Putting the guardrails up so that what you consume doesn't become all consuming, because what you do take in is gonna move you forward or not. And only you can decide that. And that's always going to be relative to where you are and where you're wanting to go. But if you look at your life in whatever dimension of your life and you're not happy or satisfied with that dimension of life, I would challenge you to be really dig deep into an examination of what is impacting that area of your life, whether it's your health or your career or your relationships. If you're not satisfied with the dimension of life, sit down one day and think about, well, what are the things that are influencing me in this dimension of life? What needs to change? What do I need to change, right? I have to take responsibility for that if I want to change it. I've got to take ownership of that. And then I've got to make the change. And sometimes that comes with a sacrifice. We can do a whole nother podcast episode on that, but I think I've talked a lot about that in previous podcast episodes. But the thing about sacrifice is we feel the loss before we get the gain. And so much of the time when we do want to make a change in our life, it's hard to give up something, to sacrifice something. And yet when we do, we eventually will realize the benefits of that. And so it's long-term thinking applied to every dimension of our life that is the key. Remember, life is tough, but God's grace is always enough. Until next time.